My name is Claire Emerson, and for most of my life, I believed in rules, not the ones you find in dusty school books or in fine print, but the kind that live in a house, the ones you grow up breathing in, the ones you feel pressed against your bones. I believed in being the good daughter. I believed that if I made myself useful, if I took up just enough space and not a drop more, if I kept my disappointments quiet and my chores finished, that love would be easy, like air. I believed if I kept my head down and worked hard, if I was kind and steady and endlessly forgiving, I'd be rewarded with family that felt like home. And maybe, in some ways, that's what they wanted from me. Maybe that's what I wanted from them, to a home. Not just a house with matching towels and hand-sewn curtains, but a place where I belonged without question. My father was a man of few words, but his silences were heavy as winter snow sometimes. I'd watch him in the garage, hunched over some project, and wait for the moment when he'd look up and see me, not as another task, not as an obligation, but as Claire, his daughter. My mother loved in practical ways, threw dinners hot on the table and band-aids on scraped knees, her touch quick and efficient, but always rushing off to the next thing. I don't remember many hugs or words of praise, but I remember her eyes flickering with pride the night I fixed the old lawnmower by myself. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. Or so I thought. And then there was Isabel, my little sister, bright, loud, impatient Isabel. She was the storm that rattled the windows and danced barefoot in the rain while I stayed inside to clean up the puddles. She was beautiful in that wild way, her hair a tangle of gold, her laughter echoing through the halls even after she'd left for some new adventure. Isabel never understood quiet. She never wanted it. She wanted attention, adoration, and she got it first from my parents, then from everyone else. I'd watch her toss her head and roll her eyes when I brought home report cards or cleaned up after her parties, as if I was the joke for caring. "You're so serious, Claire," she'd say, flicking my ear with a painted nail. "Why don't you ever have any fun?" Sometimes I wondered that too. But someone had to keep the plates spinning, the bills paid, the kitchen light on. I told myself this was my role, the dependable one, the fixer, the background harmony to her melody. We weren't rich, but we weren't poor either. Our house was the kind that creaked in winter and smelled of pine needles in summer, perched at the edge of a lake that shimmered in the morning sun. It was never just about the things: the cabin, the old wooden swing in the backyard, the garden where my mother grew tomatoes every year. It was the history, the rituals, the stories that only made sense to the people who lived inside those walls. Even when I left for college, state school, nothing fancy. Nothing my parents could boast about. At parties I kept coming back, holidays, weekends, those little emergencies that only seem to happen when you're away. When Dad broke his hip, I came home for 2 weeks to cook and clean. Then watched Isabel sweep in for 20 minutes and leave with a box of heirloom dishes for her apartment. When Mom got sick, it was me who drove her to appointments and learned to make her tea just right. Isabel sent flowers and posted photos of her brave mother online. But that's what you do for family, right? You give and you give, because maybe one day it'll be your turn, maybe one day you'll be seen. I don't remember the moment I started building my own life, not really. It happened in the spaces between, late at night, after everyone else had gone to bed. I started coding in my old bedroom, a second-hand laptop propped up on laundry baskets. Half-eaten toast and cold tea by my side. I wasn't aiming for brilliance, I just wanted something that was mine. Something that didn't shrink or twist to fit anyone else's needs. I didn't tell anyone at first. It seemed pointless. My parents wouldn't understand, and Isabel would only laugh, so I built quietly. I worked 2 jobs, poured every spare dollar and ounce of hope into that dream. My friends thought I was crazy for working so much. My family thought I was wasting my time, chasing some online fantasy. But the more they ignored it, the more real it became to me. Every tiny win felt like a rebellion. Still, I came home when they called. I remembered birthdays. I sent cards. I played the role. Sometimes I wondered what would happen if I just stopped, if I walked away from the script they'd written for me. But the fear of being left behind, of not belonging anywhere, kept me anchored. Even when Isabel barely spoke to me except to brag or ask for something, even when my parents brushed off my small successes as cute, I held on. There were good days, too. I'm not going to pretend it was all pain. There were nights on the dock with Dad, both of us silent but together. There were mornings when Mom made pancakes shaped like hearts and pretended not to notice when Isabel burned hers. There were the little traditions: planting bulbs in the fall, watching thunderstorms from the front porch, stringing lights on the Christmas tree while Isabel complained about the tinsel. Those memories are threaded through the pain, impossible to pull loose, but as the years went by, I started to feel the weight of it all. The endless giving, the silence about what I needed, the way love sometimes felt like a test. I was always one answer away from failing. It was never about big betrayals, just the slow erosion of being seen and valued. I told myself that if I could just do a little more, one more sacrifice, one more smile, they'd finally notice me, finally choose me. Sometimes, in the dark, I'd admit to myself that maybe they never would. The last time we were all together, before everything changed, was at the cabin by the lake. My father was sick, but he rallied for one final barbecue. Isabel arrived late, trailing perfume and complaints about traffic, but she lit up the room the way she always did. My parents watched her with pride and amusement, and I watched them, wondering where I fit in this picture. I helped Mom set the table, picked up empty bottles, and listened as Isabel talked about her latest boyfriend. Nobody asked about my work, nobody asked what I wanted. That night, I stood at the edge of the dock, watching the stars ripple on the water. I wondered what my life would look like if I stopped being the good daughter, if I started asking for what I deserved, instead of waiting for it to be handed to me. I didn't have an answer then. I just had the ache of longing and the hope that maybe, one day, things would change. Looking back, I realize now that everything was already in motion. The story I'd grown up believing, the one about hard work and love and being chosen, was already unraveling. I just didn't know it yet, but I would. Oh, I would. When people talk about grief, they rarely mention the paperwork. They talk about the tears, the aching emptiness at the dinner table, the silence left behind by a missing laugh, but nobody talks about the endless signatures, the dry hands passing envelopes across worn wooden tables, the strange, heavy formality that comes after a heart breaks. My parents died in early spring, 3 weeks apart, first Dad, then Mom. As if they couldn't bear to be apart even for a season. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and forced hugs, neighbors dropping off casseroles we barely touched, distant cousins asking how I was holding up. As if there was a right answer for that kind of question, I went through the motions, the good daughter to the very end. I organized, cleaned, called relatives, comforted Isabel when she arrived in a swirl of perfume and oversized sunglasses, making everything about her grief, her loss, her memories. She clung to me at the service, whispering that she didn't know how she'd get through this. I stroked her hair and told her it would be all right, even as I felt my own sorrow pressed down, flattened, tucked away for later. There's a peculiar coldness to the moment you realize the world is moving on without you. I felt it most acutely the day we gathered in my uncle's study, 2 weeks after we buried Mom. The air was thick with dust and the faded scent of pipe tobacco. Sunlight crept through the curtains, making patterns on the rug that looked like bars. Isabel arrived late, again, always late, always with an excuse, always drawing attention. My aunts sat to one side, faces pinched and tired, eyes darting from me to Isabel and back, as if trying to guess who would cry first. Uncle Richard sat behind his desk, papers stacked in neat, impersonal towers. He looked like a judge, or maybe an executioner. We all knew what was coming, or thought we did. There had always been rumors about the will, Dad dropping hints about keeping things simple, Mom saying she wanted no fighting after we're gone. I told myself I didn't care about the money or the house or the cabin. I just wanted the last scraps of family to hold together, to mean something. I told myself whatever the will said, I'd accept it. I would understand, because I was the daughter who understood. The first blow landed quietly. Uncle Richard cleared his throat, shuffled the pages, and read in his low, careful voice, the house, the savings, the cabin by the lake, everything was left to Isabel. Every last thing. There were no conditions, no explanations, just a single note scrawled in my mother's hand at the bottom of the page. Isabel deserves this. Claire will understand. I remember the sound of the clock ticking on the mantel. I remember the way my stomach twisted, the sudden flush of heat rising to my cheeks. I waited for someone to correct the mistake, to say it was a misreading, a clerical error, a cruel joke. But nobody did. Isabel gasped, then pressed a hand to her mouth as if to hide a smile. My aunts murmured in approval. Uncle Richard looked at me, his gaze both apologetic and empty, as if he'd already moved on to whatever came next. Claire will understand. That's what my mother wrote. As if understanding was the same as agreeing, as if understanding was the same as forgiveness, as if understanding would fill the empty place where love should have been. I don't remember standing up. I don't remember leaving the room. I must have said something gracious, something quiet, the way I always did. I must have smiled, nodded, agreed to whatever they needed from me. Because that's what they expected, that's what I was trained to do, but inside, I felt something shift, a deep, silent crack running through everything I'd believed. I walked outside into the chill spring air and sat on the steps of my uncle's porch, hands shaking, heart thudding like a trapped bird. Isabel burst through the door a few minutes later, clutching her phone, already calling her friends, already spinning the story to make herself the star. I watched her, her face shining with relief and victory, and realized she hadn't even looked at me, not once. My sister, the one I used to braid hair for, the one I protected from bullies and nightmares, the one I stood up for at every family dinner. She didn't even see me. I was just an obstacle she'd finally gotten past. People filtered out slowly. My aunts patted my shoulder, told me how brave I was, how mature. They spoke in soft, pitying tones, as if I were the one to be pitied. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, to say it wasn't fair, but I didn't. I couldn't. All those years of being the good daughter had taught me how to swallow hurt, how to turn rage into a polite smile. Later that night, Isabel called me drunk, giddy, triumphant. She laughed about how weird the will reading had been, how awkward my face looked. She told me not to take it personally, that Mom and Dad always wanted to take care of her because she was the sensitive one. Sensitive, as if my steadiness was a character flaw, as if her chaos deserved reward. I listened, I let her talk. I told her I was happy for her. I said all the things I was supposed to say. And then I hung up and sat in the dark, staring at the ceiling of my childhood bedroom, the walls still plastered with faded posters and old photographs. My parents' voices echoed in my head. Those little dismissals, those moments when my accomplishments were brushed aside, when my needs were treated as less important than my sister's wants. Suddenly, every memory felt sharper, tinged with bitterness I didn't want to admit. The next day, I packed my bags and left. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look back. I drove away from the house that was no longer mine, the family that had never truly seen me, and tried to imagine what my life would look like now that the story had changed. But even as I tried to leave it behind, I couldn't escape the weight of that single handwritten sentence, "Claire will understand." It echoed through my mind, turning over and over, until it didn't sound like understanding at all. It sounded like erasure. I sat in my car for a long time that night, parked outside a motel on the edge of town, watching headlights flicker across the ceiling. I thought about calling someone, an old friend, maybe, or the only aunt who'd ever listen without judgment, but the words stuck in my throat. I felt small, foolish, exposed. How do you explain to someone that you lost something you never really had? How do you confess that the thing you grieve isn't the house or the money or the cabin by the lake, but the hope that, in the end, you would finally matter? That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dim yellow light, fingers twisting the edge of a scratchy motel blanket, and let the truth settle heavy in my chest. My parents were gone, my sister had won. The family I tried so hard to please had chosen to write me out of the story. I wanted to scream, to rage, to demand justice, but I didn't. Instead, I made a quiet promise to myself. I would not let this define me. I would not let their choices become the boundaries of my life. I would find a way to move forward, even if it meant starting from nothing, even if it meant building a new story, brick by lonely brick. And for the first time in my life, as the sun began to rise beyond the motel curtains, I felt something unfamiliar stirring inside me. Not hope, exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something sharp and unbreakable, a refusal to disappear, a spark of resilience I hadn't known I possessed. There's a numbness that sets in after betrayal, a kind of slow, gray fog that drifts into every corner of your mind, dulling everything but the ache. The days after the will reading slid past, in a blur of phone calls and hollow rituals. I told myself I was just tired. I told myself I'd get over it. But everywhere I went, I saw the cracks, in the old pictures on my phone, in the empty spaces at the kitchen table, in the way every room in my apartment seemed too quiet, too big. Grief is an odd companion. Sometimes it shrieks and claws, demanding your full attention. Sometimes it sits in silence, just waiting for you to notice it. After my parents' funeral and the will, my grief was the silent kind of weight in my chest that made it hard to breathe, to move, to do much of anything, but go through the motions. I got up every day, made coffee I never finished, stared at my laptop screen until the words blurred. People reached out. They wanted to know if I was okay. They wanted to help. But no one really knew what to say when I told them the truth. It wasn't just loss. It was erasure. It was finding out in black and white legal print that your love was never quite enough, that maybe you weren't enough. Isabel, meanwhile, bloomed. She moved into the house within a week, posting photos on social media, her with boxes stacked high, her with her new keys, her with our old family dog perched on her lap. She tagged me in one post, a photo of the two of us as kids, standing side by side in matching Christmas sweaters, grinning at the camera. Her caption read, "Family is everything, missing you." Mom and Dad. I stared at that photo for a long time. The comments flooded in. "You're so strong, Isabel. Your parents would be so proud. Claire is lucky to have a sister like you." I couldn't bring myself to respond. I couldn't even bring myself to delete the tag. It felt like watching someone else live my life, someone louder, brighter, easier to love. I called Isabel once, a few days after she moved in. I told myself it was to check on her, to make sure she was settling in, but really, I wanted her to see me. I wanted her to say something real, to admit she was sorry, to acknowledge that what our parents had done was cruel. She answered on the second ring, her voice syrupy with excitement. "Oh. Hey Claire, I'm just in the middle of rearranging the living room. Can you believe Mom put the sofa against the wrong wall all those years? Honestly, it looks so much better now. Did you want something?" Her words stung more than I expected. I heard laughter in the background, music playing, glasses clinking, her friends already making themselves at home in the place where we'd grown up. I tried to talk, to tell her I was struggling, but she was already moving on, listing off the things she wanted to change, the memories she wanted to refresh. She laughed about how outdated Mom's style had been, how much work the house needed. Finally, I couldn't take it. "Doesn't it feel strange?" I asked, "being there without them?" She paused for a heartbeat, then let out a little snort. "Claire, don't be so dramatic. People die, life goes on. I'm just trying to make this place mine, you know? You should do the same. Stop clinging to the past." I wanted to scream at her, to demand how she could be so callous. Instead, I just mumbled something about being busy and hung up. My hands were shaking. That was the thing about Isabel. She could make you feel small without even trying. She had a way of dismissing my pain as overreaction, my devotion as weakness, my ambitions as childish dreams. When I got my first job, out of college, she'd laughed at my starting salary, called it cute. When I told her about my startup, she said, "That's nice, Claire, but don't you want a real job?" Even in childhood, she knew how to command the room. She was the one with tantrums that got attention, the one whose scraped knees got extra kisses, the one whose failures were forgiven and successes celebrated. I was the background, a good report card here, a clean kitchen there, always present, always steady. Never the cause for worry or pride. I told myself I liked it that way, but after the will, I realized how lonely it had been. My aunts and uncles reached out too. Their voices were soft, almost patronizing. They told me how kind it was of me to take everything so gracefully, how mature I was for not making a fuss. Aunt Leela sent me a card. "You've always been the rock in this family. Isabel needs this more than you. She's been through so much." I wanted to tear the card in half. "Isabel needs this," as if my needs didn't exist, as if my grief was less valid, my loss less real, as if the only thing I was good for was to quietly accept what I was given and what I wasn't. I started to replay old memories, picking them apart, looking for clues I'd missed. The Christmas I spent my entire bonus on gifts for everyone, only to have Isabel whine that hers wasn't the right color. The birthday when my mother forgot to call, blaming it on being so busy with Isabel's college move. The countless times my father praised Isabel for finding her own way, while my own independence was seen as a sign I didn't need them at all. I realized that for years I'd been fighting for a place I was never meant to have. I'd clung to the hope that if I just tried hard enough, loved deeply enough, forgave quickly enough, I'd be seen, that I'd matter. The will made it clear I was an afterthought, a footnote. The daughter who would understand. But here's the secret about people who are always overlooked. We learn how to survive in the shadows. We learn how to build things no one notices, to create value out of scraps. To find comfort in our own company. My pain didn't make me weak, it made me resourceful. I poured myself into work, not because I wanted to prove anything to them anymore, but because it was the one place I felt real. My little tech company, mocked by Isabel, ignored by my family, became my lifeline. Every late night, every closed deal, every hard-won success felt like a secret act of rebellion. I didn't need their applause, I needed my own pride. There were nights when the loneliness pressed in so tightly, I thought I might break. But then I'd remember the look on Isabel's face at the will reading, the hungry, gleaming triumph in her eyes. And something inside me hardened. They had chosen to erase me from their story. I could choose to write my own. I stopped answering calls from relatives who wanted to soothe their guilt with my good manners. I stopped explaining myself to people who'd never really listened. For the first time, I let myself grieve, not just for my parents, but for the family I'd always hoped for and never had. It hurt. God, it hurt, but with each passing day, I felt the old shell of the good daughter crack and fall away. Underneath, there was something new, something fierce, something unyielding. They could minimize me, mock me, erase me from their will, but I was still here, and I was just getting started. I used to think that building a life in secret was a kind of shame, like a child hiding a drawing under the bed, too afraid it would be laughed at or thrown away. For years, I kept my real work tucked beneath the surface, polished, private, invisible. My parents knew I had a job in computers. Isabel called it Claire's little tech thing. The way you talk about a toddler's lemonade stand. They never once asked what I did all day, what I was building, what it meant to me to wake up with a purpose that belonged to no one else. But in the long months after my parents' death, that hidden world was the only thing that made sense. I let myself fall into it late nights at my kitchen table. The hush of code and coffee. The soft hum of ambition that no one else had ever witnessed or believed in. I worked because work made me feel alive. I built because building was how I survived. Each new contract, each little client email, each number ticking upward in my bank account felt like a tiny splinter of light poking through the fog. If the family home had been my mother's kingdom, my tech company was my battered fortress. It didn't look like much from the outside, just a home office full of tangled cords, a half-dead spider plant, stacks of notebooks filled with lists and dreams. But it was mine. Every hard-won lesson, every sleepless night, every no turned into a quiet, stubborn yes. I had taught myself to be resourceful, to code and pitch and negotiate, to learn from mistakes, to swallow rejection and keep going when nobody was watching. At first, I had to fight for scraps. I took on the jobs nobody else wanted: late-night website repairs for tiny shops, app troubleshooting for overworked parents, data cleanup for friends of friends. The money was laughable, but I kept going. I learned the patience of starting at zero, the grind of slowly building something from nothing. No one in my family saw any of this. They didn't see the fear, the loneliness, the occasional spark of pride when a project finally worked. They didn't see the nights I sat alone at my desk, hands shaking, wondering if I was just playing pretend. They didn't see me at all. That hurt, but it also freed me. For a long time, I worked as if I had something to prove, maybe to my parents, maybe to Isabel, maybe to the little girl I used to be, the one who thought love was earned in chores and good grades. But after the will, something shifted. I stopped caring about their approval. Their opinion, I realized, was just another story I didn't have to believe in. Their absence gave me a strange new permission. If I was going to be erased, I might as well be the one to decide what I'd write in my own margins. Work became not just a distraction, but a sanctuary. I started taking risks, the kind I never would have dared when I still believed I needed their love to survive. I pitched bigger clients, invested in bolder ideas. I hired help, quiet, clever people who understood my vision and didn't care about my last name. I made mistakes, learned from them, got up again. Slowly, the business that started as a little tech thing began to shift beneath my feet. I wasn't scraping by anymore. I was building something real. I didn't talk about it, not to Isabel, not to the aunts who called to check in on my feelings, not to the friends who still saw me as the reliable one. But when I lay awake at night, the knowledge was like a secret flame in my chest. I was worth more than any room I'd ever cleaned, more than any hollow apology, more than any place at a table set by someone else. I had built my own table, and for the first time, I wanted to invite people to sit beside me who valued me for what I was, not just what I gave. My parents' will had made me invisible in their eyes, but it had also made me untouchable. There was nothing left to lose. I could be reckless, daring, even a little bit ruthless in my own quiet way. I started looking at investments, properties, opportunities. It was partly strategy, partly revenge. If I couldn't inherit the house, maybe I could own the block. If Isabel wanted to flaunt what she'd been handed, let her. I was busy earning everything she'd been given. One night, a few months after the funeral, I sat with my accountant reviewing a stack of documents. I half listened as he droned on about growth and projections, but then something caught my attention. He mentioned a deed transfer, an old mortgage, a foreclosure on a property address that looked familiar. I stared at the numbers, my mind turning over slowly. It was the family home, my parents' house. It had been quietly mortgaged years ago. He said, leveraged to cover some debts. The mortgage had changed hands, bounced between lenders, and now, through a string of acquisitions and legal paperwork, it belonged to one of my companies. I sat there, stunned. As the truth trickled in, I owned the house Isabel was so proud of, the house she posed in, the house she'd inherited with a flourish. It was mine, not through sentiment or tradition, but through the stubborn work no one had ever respected, through resilience, through building what no one saw. I didn't laugh, I didn't gloat in that moment. I just felt tired of wanting what they'd never give, tired of being the background, the afterthought, the good daughter who'd be fine with whatever scraps were left. I was done waiting for permission. I didn't need a seat at their table. I had built my own empire while they looked the other way. That night, I sat at my desk and pulled up the deed, the legal documents, the evidence of everything I'd accomplished when nobody was watching. I didn't feel angry. Not really. I felt the deep, satisfying ache of a wound finally starting to heal. For the first time, my story was mine, not a footnote, not a sacrifice, not a lesson in patience and endurance. Mine. I didn't tell Isabel. I didn't tell anyone. Some things are sweeter in silence, sweeter when they are yours alone. I knew what I would do next. It would hurt, yes, but not as much as being erased. I looked out my window at the city lights, and I promised myself never again would I shrink myself to fit into someone else's story. Never again would I beg for scraps. I had built something they could never take from me, a life, an empire, a name that belonged only to me. And for the first time in my life, I didn't need anyone to see me. I saw myself, and that was enough. Some people move into a house as if it's a shell, a shelter, a place to keep the rain out and the world at bay. Others move in like they're staking a claim, unrolling themselves into every corner, making the walls and windows a mirror of their own ego. Isabel was always the latter. I could see it from the first photos she posted online. The family dining room gutted, the hand-stitched curtains gone, our mother's old lamp tossed out for something glossy and new. She painted the front door a pale blue, and every picture came with a hashtag and a knowing smirk. If I'm honest, there was a part of me that watched with a kind of detached fascination. She moved through grief so easily, so publicly. She threw a housewarming within weeks, photos of wine glasses and little gold confetti hearts scattered across the table that once held our Thanksgiving dinners. Friends I barely recognized filled the rooms, laughing in the glow of candles I'd bought for Mom to birthdays ago. I wondered, not for the first time, if I was the only one who ever held on to the past. One Saturday, I drove by the house. I told myself it was just curiosity, just closure. I parked across the street and watched from behind the safety of my windshield. Isabel's car was in the driveway. I could see her moving through the kitchen, her shape flitting from window to window, music echoing out every time she opened the back door. She moved with confidence, as if the place had always been hers, as if nothing of me or my memories lingered in the paint or the creak of the floorboards. I sat there for nearly an hour. I watched her carry out armfuls of old things, boxes with Claire scrawled in my mother's looping handwriting, bags filled with clothes I'd forgotten in the back of my closet, even a dusty showbox of childhood art projects and report cards. She didn't look at the contents, didn't seem to care. I saw her toss the box onto the porch, brushing her hands together, moving on to the next task. It was like watching a stranger erase me, one memory at a time. Eventually, I forced myself out of the car and walked up the familiar path. My hands shook not with anger, but with the old ache of being small, of asking for permission to take up space. I knocked, and Isabel opened the door with a burst of synthetic citrus and a flash of white teeth. She looked surprised, then annoyed, then slid on the mask of sisterly politeness she wore like cheap jewelry. Well, look who's here. Her voice was light, brittle, tinged with just enough condescension to let me know I wasn't really welcome. I tried to keep my tone even. I came for my things. She stepped aside, letting me enter the house that used to be ours. It smelled different now, something sharp and chemical beneath the scent of freshly cut flowers. The walls were bare where our family photos had hung for decades. New furniture crowded the rooms. All glossy surfaces and sharp angles, nothing of the softness I remembered. Isabel watched as I gathered my boxes, tapping her nails against the counter. You know, you should really let go, Claire. This house, it needed a fresh start. Mom and Dad would have wanted it to feel alive again. I looked at her, really looked at the lines of fatigue around her eyes, the impatience simmering beneath her veneer of confidence. It was always alive, just not the way you wanted. She shrugged, waving her hand dismissively. Don't be so sentimental. It's just stuff. You're better off without it. Besides, I have enough on my plate dealing with repairs. Did you know the pipes are ancient? I have to replace half the wiring, too. Dad never kept up with anything. The bitterness in her voice startled me. She spoke about the house like it was a burden, a problem to be solved, not a home full of memories and hard work. I realized then that she would never see it the way I did. She would never see me, either. I finished collecting my things in silence. The dog, Old Gray, a remnant of our childhood, limped into the hallway and stared at me with clouded eyes. I knelt and scratched behind his ears, whispering a quiet goodbye. Isabel didn't notice. As I stood to leave, she followed me to the door. Are you going to be okay, Claire? You seem a little lost. Her voice was false sweet, edged with that same mocking tone she'd used on me since we were kids. For a moment, I wanted to scream at her, to spill out every resentment, every hurt, every memory of being minimized, ignored, erased. But instead, I found my voice steady and almost calm. I'll be fine, Isabel. I always am. She laughed, a brittle sound. Good, because, you know, not everyone lands on their feet like you do. I let her believe whatever she wanted. I walked out with my boxes, the old showbox tucked beneath my arm. I set it gently in the trunk of my car, then sat in the driver's seat, my chest tight and aching. It struck me then how much of my life I'd spent waiting for someone else to decide what I deserved. Waiting for love, for recognition, for a sliver of respect. How easy it had been for Isabel to step into the spotlight, to claim what she wanted, to remake the world in her own image. And how quietly, stubbornly, I had built something she couldn't touch. The world inside that house was hers now, shaped by her desires, her needs, her story, but beyond its walls. I owned more than she could imagine. My worth didn't depend on her approval or my parents' validation. I had built a life from the ground up, forged from every moment I'd been overlooked. As I drove away, the late afternoon light slanting through the trees, I felt something uncoil in my chest. Not peace exactly, but a clearing, a sense that I could finally breathe, finally step forward without dragging the weight of someone else's judgment behind me. That night, I sat at my desk and opened the showbox. Inside were scraps of a life, crumpled drawings, old birthday cards, a faded photo of two little girls in matching dresses, smiling as if they didn't yet know what could come between them. I pressed my palm to the lid and closed my eyes. Grief pressed in, but so did something else. The quiet, unbreakable promise that I would not disappear, not now, not ever. I always thought heartbreak would leave me shattered, but in reality, it left me sharper, like a glass that's cracked but refuses to break. It was during another late night at my desk, sorting paperwork for my business, that I found it, an address my childhood home buried in a spreadsheet of assets. At first, I thought it was a mistake. My accountant had flagged it, tracing a trail of mortgage notes passed from bank to bank, quietly bundled and sold off like so many others. I sat frozen as the truth came into focus. Years ago, my parents had mortgaged the house, desperate for cash, and in the tangled world of business, acquisitions, and debts, The deed had ended up in a company I'd recently acquired, one with my name on every page. The house was legally mine. Isabel's inheritance was only a mirage. I stared at the paperwork, equal parts disbelief and a strange, hard relief. All those years I'd been quietly building. Hustling through late nights and lonely weekends, my work had circled back to reclaim the very thing I'd been denied. For a moment, I considered letting Isabel keep it, to avoid another fight, but then I remembered her laughter, the way she'd toss my memories aside, the look of casual ownership in her eyes. I thought of my parents' words, "Claire will understand," and realized I finally did. I was never meant to stay quiet, to be erased, to disappear for anyone's comfort. So I called my attorney, my voice steady, my hands no longer shaking. We drafted the letter, and I prepared myself for the storm I knew was coming. For once, I wasn't afraid. I arrived at the house just as the sun began to dip, casting the porch in golden light, the same porch where I'd waited for my father to come home, for my mother to call us in for supper. Isabel opened the door, confusion flickering across her face as she saw the envelope in my hand. For a heartbeat, I almost softened, but then I remembered every room stripped of warmth, every memory tossed out like trash, and the words they'd left behind. "Claire will understand." I handed her the letter, no drama, no raised voice, just a quiet apology. "You'll need to vacate within 30 days. It's legal, I own the deed." The world seemed to tilt. Isabel stared, blinking hard, the color draining from her cheeks. Then her confusion twisted into outrage. "You can't do this. This is my house, Mom and Dad." But I stood firm, feeling that calm certainty in my bones. "No, Isabel, it never was, not really, and you don't get to decide what I deserve anymore." She screamed, wild, betrayed. Our aunts rushed in, voices trembling, pleading for mercy, for understanding. I met their panic with steady silence. I wouldn't be the villain in their story, but I wouldn't be their scapegoat either. For the first time, I didn't flinch, didn't shrink. I stood on that old porch, taller than I'd ever felt, letting them rage and beg and accuse. I wasn't the daughter who needed to be chosen. I was the woman who knew what she was worth, and as the sun slipped below the trees, I realized I wasn't afraid of losing them anymore. I was finally free. The days that followed were a blur of angry phone calls and desperate messages. My aunts begged me to reconsider. "Think of family, Claire. Think of what your parents would have wanted." Isabel's text swung between threats and pleas, sometimes blaming me for everything, sometimes promising she'd make things right if I'd just forget the letter. Each call left me rattled, but I refused to answer. Instead, I sat with the ache, letting it burn. There was guilt, yes, a heavy, suffocating guilt that crept in late at night, whispering that I'd become everything I'd tried not to be. Was I cold now? Was I cruel? I remembered the years I'd been the peacemaker, the fixer, the one who smoothed everything over so nobody else had to feel uncomfortable. Now, standing my ground, I could feel old doubts clawing at the edges of my resolve. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't acting out of vengeance. I was claiming space I'd always been denied. For the first time, I confided in friends who'd always seen my worth, who reminded me that boundaries aren't betrayal. I found comfort in their certainty, their gentle reminders that loving yourself sometimes means letting go of those who only love you when you stay small. By the end of the week, the guilt began to fade, replaced by a quiet pride. I wasn't heartless. I was finally honoring myself, and in the soft light of early morning, I whispered a promise. I would never let guilt make me disappear again. The 30 days ticked by in slow, aching increments. Each time I drove past the house, I saw Isabel's car still in the driveway, curtains drawn tight. I knew she was avoiding me, and part of me ached for her, for the little girls we'd once been, for the family we might have had if things were different. There were nights I lay awake, torn by memories, the laughter echoing across the lake, the sound of our parents' voices drifting through open windows. Those small moments when love almost felt easy. But the ache wasn't just for Isabel, it was for every hope I'd tucked away, every dream I'd postponed so someone else could have what they wanted first. As the deadline grew closer, I wrote Isabel a final letter, not to gloat or to shame, but to say the things that needed saying for my own peace. I told her I wished things had been different. I told her I still wanted good things for her, even if we could never go back to what we were. On the day she moved out, I didn't go to the house. Instead, I took a long walk by the water, breathing in the morning air. letting the cold wind sting my cheeks. I let myself feel the loss deep and real, but I also felt lighter than I had in years. Letting go wasn't weakness. It was the first honest act of love I'd given myself in a lifetime. And as the last leaves fell from the trees, I realized that freedom wasn't always found in getting what you want. Sometimes it was found in letting go of what no longer fit, and walking forward with your head held high. The house stood empty, every echo a memory. I walked through the rooms one last time, letting my hand trail along the walls. There was grief. Yes, but also a strange sense of peace. I no longer needed their validation, their approval, or a place at their table. I'd built my own. I didn't keep the house. Instead, I donated it, turning it into a retreat for women starting over, a space for those who'd been told, like me, they were too much or not enough. I wanted something good to grow from the ashes. Standing on the porch, sun on my face, I felt whole. I wasn't the daughter who'd been left behind. I was a woman who knew her worth, who made her own legacy out of loss. For the first time, I belonged to myself, and to a future I chose. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever felt overlooked by the people who should have loved you most? We put our hearts into every video, so your voice matters here. Hit subscribe and join our community of survivors and dreamers. Every click helps us tell more stories like Claire's, stories of quiet strength, hope, and finding your worth. When the world tries to erase you, don't disappear. Let yourself be heard. Subscribe now, it's just one click.